I'm Jonathan Weinberg, and we're going to do a portrait today. It is March 19th, 2022, and I'm with Dan Wood.
And I am Dan Wood, and I am a printer and artist from Providence, Rhode Island.
Excellent. Okay. And Dan, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what kind of art you make for printing?
So I'll just say in efforts at full disclosure, I've been warned by the artist to not move so quickly. So if I seem more restrained, it's because I'm trying very hard not to shake around too much. So I'm an artist. I work as a letterpress printer. I run a print shop called DWRI Letterpress, and I've been doing letterpress printing on some level commercially since, I guess, 1994-ish, and that's how I met Jonathan.
Cool. So, and also you teach at
Yes,
RISD,
and
right?
I teach part-time. I teach a letterpress class part-time at RISD.
Right. Right from the beginning, what is a letterpress? Because a lot of people probably don't know what that is.
Letterpress printing basically is relief printing. Okay, so relief printing, for anyone who doesn't know what that is the simplest form of transferring image onto another surface in relief. So you have a raised surface, you cut away what you don't want to print, and then whatever is left, in this case it's 5 dots, you print it, and then you get those 5 dots printed. So that's relief printing. Letterpress, as far as I'm concerned, letterpress is known as the sort of process that got its sort of commercial start with a bang, and then it just went crazy, from Gutenberg in 1450, meaning it's typographic letterpress printing where you have movable characters, which you're rearranging for every print, and then every sheet, printing multiple copies and rearranging for the next sheet. However, as I say to the students every time, typographic letterpress printing was happening in China as far back as the 8th and 9th century, and then with clay tablets, and then again in Korea in the 12th and 13th century with actual cast metal type, very similar to European cast metal type, cast lead type, making a brass mold, carving a steel character, punching it, casting it. And so what Gutenberg brought into the picture was the printing press. And so he took a wine press or an olive press, fruit press, and then whether it was a complete reinvention of movable type or there were information he had picked up, from the East, who knows? But it was his contribution was the printing press, just as paper was coming into Europe from North Africa, and so his timing was very good. And then the Renaissance, they wanted information, so it all sort of worked out. So letterpress printing, as far as I'm concerned, is relief printing that's been mechanized with the printing press. So you can use metal movable type, you can cast type, which I do, and you can also use polymer plates, which is a digital plastic. It's a plastic water-soluble plate that's light-sensitive. So you make a piece of film, and then from that film, you make a plate and then can print multiple copies. So that's sort of my artwork and my work.
And for a lot of people, their most obvious connection to letterpress might be like wedding invitations.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So when I first, I used to do printing offset. I worked as a commercial offset printer. So I went to art school. So my background is I grew up in Boston, in the South End, with my mom, who's very politically active in various, movements and local political things and national political things, etc. And then my dad's family was all from Rhode Island, so we'd spend time with him in Boston, but mainly in Rhode Island. But originally I went to school in Canada, Montreal, at McGill, studying history for 2 years. Left that, came back to Boston to the South End, and then eventually went because I wanted to go to art school. I decided. In our last take, he asked me why I was an artist, but we'll get back to that. Art school. But so I went to study history, even though I knew I wanted to study art. But the arrogance of the young person is, well, why waste, I know I'm going to be an artist. Why would I want to waste my time studying art when I could study something else that'll inform my art? And so then I went to a school that had very little for art programs. I'm like, well, this is done.
McGill.
Yeah. So Concordia, Concordia has good art programs. So,
you are the most, it must have to do with movable type.
Okay, yes. Shoot, I forgot to try not to move. Okay, I'm back.
It's funny, the first person that I did just recently, and we're mutual friends. We were all friends. Is Andrew Raftery, who actually introduced me to Dan.
That's true.
And he is the most static person. He knows, he's very aware because he's done a lot of posing for his own students.
I just pose in real life.
Right. You're a poseur.
Yeah, exactly.
That's different.
I tell the students right away.
There's a wonderful David Hockney, when his best friend was a curator and art historian named Henry Geltzeller, and when Henry died, David Hockney did this wonderful kind of memorial. There was a memorial service, and David Hockney spoke about Henry and his admiration, and he said that one of the reasons he painted him so much was because he was so good and stayed still.
So the point is, I'm going to try to stand still.
Yes. Well, a little bit. So far, you're failing.
Okay. No, I know. It's you can sit here and just go, try not to move. Try not to move. Try not to move. And then you get distracted.
No, but I like, it's a challenge. It's interesting. And also, so I'm trying to think of interesting artist stories that relate to that. So Delacroix supposedly said, I don't know if it's true, but that if a good artist should be able to draw someone who has like hurled himself off over a cliff and be done with the drawing by the time they hit the ground. I was told that.
Funny.
I was told that. The best quote though about art, about doing portraits, is Sargent, who said that a portrait is a painting with something wrong with the mouth, because it is the hardest part of painting a portrait is the line of the mouth, because it's always changing. Well, if you're talking, it's always moving.
You have to breathe too.
Yes, indeed.
Being an artist and just being able to, coming to the realization that you have it's not like you're gifted, you've been chosen by the gods, but you have developed or you've been interested in, or somehow you sort of see in the society that for whatever reason you are sort of able to translate your ideas or something you see in a way that someone else can see it in the same way or see it in a different way than they saw it before, which I feel like really is such a lucky. I think many people have this ability to change another person's perspective. Like that's not the whole point, but I feel like it is such especially with a visual artist, to be able to do a few quick line drawings of something and be able to contain so much specificity about that person, whether it's a kid or an adult human, it is such like my daughter does some visual arts, and even like some of these younger drawings where you're just like, there's a drawing on my phone, and so she'd done a drawing of us with green tea, right?
Oh, okay.
But there is something where you see one person doing it and you're like, wow, how does that person, and I work with artists throughout my life, that it is really amazing when someone can just a couple, you can not necessarily capture essence, but convey so much. It's kind of amazing.
Well, I think it's, and then also I think it's all about specificity. It's one of the things that, over the years in crits and everything, because I do a lot of stuff that has to do with queer art and everything, and then there'll be invariably, and to my chagrin, yes, there might be a teacher who will say, well, I'm not gay, how am I supposed to identify? Or, first of all, we have empathy. You don't have to be, I can see a movie about coal miners. I don't have to be a coal miner to be interested, to get that. Right? Anyway, so it's often the story of the specific story, which actually has the ability to be universal in an interesting way, because it has a kind of truth and reality to it that you can then empathize with. While if you try for universality, you end up coming up with something which is just generic. It doesn't have that kind of weight.
You say that to students in crits too?
Yes. No, but it's I don't necessarily say that in crits.
Yeah,
but when somebody might say, as they have, when they see a queer work of art, they'll say something like, "Oh, well, how am I supposed to identify with that?" Right? Or it just drives me crazy. Often, actually, art that is about women is often, even though women are the majority, is often talked about in that way too, as if, oh, well, somehow or other this is too specific to, it can't be universal because it's too much about feminism or it's about, something like that. And I always find that extremely
dummies.
Well,
because it is like that. It's such a strange. It really is a strange thing. The point that you just made there, that the more specific, the more honest. Honesty is pretty important in making artwork. But the more honest and the more specific it is, the more other people are going to. Like no one else necessarily is waking up at 6 a.m. and smelling that exact cigarette smell or the lawnmower smell or whatever the thing, and the light's not going to be hitting, but that the absolute specificity of that experience is making it accessible for all of their specific experiences.
Yes.
Which is really interesting.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Am I doing any better?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. I mean, the problem with art making, I think, in general, and I'm always arguing with myself, is that you can't really make any rules. There's no way, no formula.
That's true.
You could get really caught up in the weeds of detail.
Yes,
and
that's true. It can just be incredibly boring.
Right. So it's so anyway, coming back to you and printmaking, and how did you get into this world? You started to talk a little bit about it.
Right, and even in high school, I think I'd taken a photo class. I was lucky.
And where was this?
So this is outside of Boston at a school called Cambridge School of Weston, right? Okay. Which is like a private, progressive school that when my brother had gone there.
What did your parents do?
So both my parents are architects.
Ah, okay.
So my mom...
The whole family of artists.
I suppose. So my mom's mom was a piano teacher from Chicago, and her dad had run a drugstore. But she was like very, 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 and I think she had hurt her hand and she stopped performing and became a teacher. Can't remember exactly, but so there's a creative element there. My mom had wanted to study art, but became an architect because she figured there was a better way to make a living. Ha! So, especially for a woman, I think she went to Harvard for a year and then transferred to MIT because at Harvard she was the only woman. This is in the 1950s. So at MIT she was one of 3 women.
Wow.
And then my dad was also an architect. He had studied...
trying to look at the charts here.
He had studied...
Good. We're getting there.
Physics, and then was drafted in the Army and was one of the people who had seen the 13 nuclear atomic tests in Anahuac. And so decided at that point not to, when he got out of the Army, keep studying physics, and then went to architecture school. So that's how he sort of got into it. But yeah, so there was a lot of, it was not a foreign world to me, for sure. And then when I was, so I knew it was something, becoming an adult, that there was going to be a part of my life that I wanted to do in some way or another. But going to schools, I decided I wanted to study history because, I like the world. And it's always, I feel like I was lucky early in my education to get to the point where it's really interesting to study anything long enough to get to the point that you don't know anything about it. That's sort of like, to me, that's like part of the point of any college or any kind of high school education, is just to get to the point where you really realize things are super, there's some rules to it, but things are really complicated. And so if you just to have that understanding is good. So either way, went to McGill, studied history for 2 years, took some art classes at Concordia, but it was really difficult to take art classes at other schools because the classes would fill up and then there wouldn't be any room. So eventually I left and then took some time off and eventually went to RISD, where I was actually one of Andrew Raftery's students in his first year of teaching, I think. Maybe something like that. So
So how though letterpress?
And so when I was in, that's what I was going to say, yeah. So when I was in high school, I was lucky enough to have the art school teacher there also happened to be a printmaker. And so she taught an etching class. And etchings were super fun because it's another printmaking process. But with the etching, you can do what I would consider not a great drawing. And as a grown-up, alive artist, it's hard to say, well, there's some bad drawings out there. But you could do like not a great drawing, but then you turn to an etching. And you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. So my first appeal to printmaking was not that it could take bad drawings and make them look good, but just that, like as a process, it was so much fun.
Right.
And then very quickly, I got more interested in printmaking in that, because I think I took etching class at McGill too. I did and I think for me as an artist, I for a long time have needed that technical distraction to make the work that I would want to make. So for like you as a painter, or if you're a person who's working on a drawing, there's just as many technical distractions or just as much technology involved to a certain degree. And you're just sort of working with your hand and the brush to do your thing. But for me, I need this humongous printing press and this bath of acid and all these gears. That's the thing that I'm paying attention to.
Well, also there is kind of the whole layering that happens in printmaking, which really doesn't happen in painting, right?
It's true, and you're making it. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, also you can go backwards in an interesting way. You can't. Painting is a series of destructions. Every time that I make a mark, I have to cover up something,
right?
And I can't go backwards, right? The way you can with writing, you can edit and change it and then put it back, or use the same thing.
You're building things on top.
Etching has some of that destruction, but you could always do a different plate, and you can correct. People think it's hard work, but you can go back and redo things.
Yeah,
and, you got a lot of. You can redo in painting. You can cover up.
Yeah,
but you can't sort of go back to a line the way it was, and you can't. It's they're different. They love different things.
And I think the other part with printmaking, especially with letterpress, is and even with etching too, you're making. What you are creating is this three-dimensional plate, which is going to be used to make the print, which is going to be slightly three-dimensional.
Right.
But to be, you're looking at a two-dimensional visual work. And so this other thing that's fun about printmaking is, like for me, I like the distraction of the process, but also the thing that I'm making, especially with etching, you take it out of the bath, and there's this copper plate, and it's turning all these crazy colors, right? Mm-hmm. And you as the artist are getting to experience, not like it's all mine, but the process is so much a part of the making of it, but that's only for you, or it's only for whomever you're working with. That there's something about like, I am working through this process that's going to create this thing in multiples, right? But there's the three-dimensionality of this object you're making is really kind of fun.
Yeah, I've always thought one of the interesting things about it is how, because it has this, literally the way it's physically imprinted into the paper, it has a kind of weightiness and presence that, for its size, right? So a print that might be 9 by 12 has the sort of command of a picture, a painting that's twice as big, something like that. I don't know what the exact ratio would be. Yeah. But to me, that's very interesting. Well,
there is that element of they wouldn't print it if it wasn't true. There's a certain authority.
Yes.
That you're helping to create, which is kind of funny.
Yeah. No, I've always thought that was one of the things.
There's like a permanence to it.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily more permanent than a painting, but...
Right. Well, that's why I've always sort of liked the kind of printing that, like letterpress, that really is embossed into the paper, while, a silk screen doesn't have the same presence.
It's kind of shallow.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, I guess it's more like a painting or something. I don't.
For some of these things. But either way, so then I went to study printmaking. I think my main attraction to prints was, there's the physicality of the making. I like the distraction. And then also, as a process, it's all about the multiple, which to me is just such a neat concept and a much more democratic concept for art making. And that's not saying that painting is not going to be democratic, or sculpture or public art or whatever, but built into it, there's no one single original. It's just an edition or multiple editions of prints.
Multiple is the fancy word in the printmaking world.
Right.
That you can make lots of copies.
Yes, copies. Lots of copies, exactly. So either way, then before I graduated, I knew I'm graduating finally with an art degree, which is probably not like your ticket to economic stability or success. So I'm like, okay, I need to make sure I'm getting a job. And so in the last year, I took an offset printing class, which they used to have in the photo department, and a welding class.
What's that? I don't even know what that is.
So offset printing is offset lithography.
Oh, offset printing.
Yeah, offset printing. Yes. Yeah. So it's commercial. For those living inside the camera, it's commercial. It's how most commercial printing is done. It's a commercial form of lithography, which is totally flat, but instead of printing directly from the plate or the stone onto the paper, and lithography involves ink and water and grease. So you've altered the surface of your stone or your plate, so it's going to be grease receptive or not, and then where the grease is, it's going to be water repellent. And then when it's damp but not wet but not dry, you ink it, and the ink can't go where the water is, and then you can keep repeating the process over and over again. With offset printing, you don't have to wait for it to dry to print. You print onto a rubber, sort of rubber blanket or a rubber cylinder, and then it picks up the ink, and then that can get transferred to the paper. So it's a second offset. It's like a second generation print. And so from that, that's the technology that commercially sort of superseded, I don't know if that's the right word, or overseeded, but took over from letterpress printing because it was so much cheaper. So letterpress ended up being the process from, basically the way to commercially share ideas via print from the 1450s until like easily the 1950s to 1900s. Say it was basically all commercially printed things, images the exception, in some cases would be printed letterpress, and now it's offset printing. So in school I decided, okay, I better learn something that's going to help me get a job. So I learned how to do offset printing, and then also welding, because I figured, okay, those are, like, I like to work with my hands, and so I thought, well, those are two good things. I could, at least there'll be some kind of a job. And so when I graduated, I started, my first job was at the Johnson Wales University print shop, or mail room, and so I was working as a typesetter / sometimes press operator, and I was all excited because it was my first paycheck that said printing, like in the department of Johnson Wales University, and it said printing, so I was excited about that. And then worked for the next.
And was that when you were still at RISD?
No, so this is just when I left, like
okay.
when I graduated.
But you were still in Providence. Huh?
Yeah, so I was still in Providence. Yeah. So then I worked for the next 8 to 10 years as a commercial press operator, like sometimes working the computer and on the press, but mostly just as a press operator. And then that was in Providence, and then in DC, where my partner, how do you say? So I guess you'd say your fiance, wife, and then ex-wife. Anyways, then partner was going to grad school, and so I worked for 2 years down there at a place called Community Press, then came back to Rhode Island, and then in that time I was also using commercial offset presses to make my artwork so that I could be, and most of the times I would, when I came back to Rhode Island in particular, if I got a job, I would make arrangements with the shop owner to say, hey, can I use the press on nights or on the weekend if I have this project coming up, and then in that case, I was doing editions of prints that would be like 100, 250, with many, many, many passes through the press. And so, but at the same time, I started to get interested in letterpress printing. So actually, right off the bat, when I was still at Johnson & Wales working, I had met a guy named Gary Richmond, who's an artist who taught at URI, and made artist books, and showed him a book I'd recently printed, and he hired me, just having met me in the hallway. He's like, oh, did you print this? And yeah. And he basically hired me on the spot to print his next artist book. And I did not know how to use a letterpress, because it was going to be a letterpress cover. I did not know that much about offset printing, because I think this is when I just got hired at Johnson & Wales. And so... but
you didn't let him know that.
I can't remember what I said. I said, yes, I printed this book. And then he said, can I hire you to print my book? And I said, sure. I think it was one of those situations where you really do appreciate the term creative accounting, because when I added everything up, using very positively creative accounting, I could say I made 50 cents. But that's like really stretching it and not including labor. You know, if you ordered all the paper that I kept having to buy.
Or you mean making it for him, but you
Yes.
didn't make any money. But you
Correct.
learned a lot.
I did. Yep. And so, then I started to do letterpress, and I started to do letterpress and offset a little bit on the side, and then I just kept doing that while I was working as an offset printer throughout until maybe the year 2002 when my daughter Roma was born, and at that point I was working, still doing a lot of side jobs and then working for another offset printer, and I finally quit my part-time offset job, kept my part-time working for myself job, and then Anne, when was mom, my wife, at the time, was working full-time, so I was the one working part-time taking care of the kid, and eventually that part-time just became my full income. Learning so much.
All right, so talk about, so what you haven't talked about really is the actual art that you make.
Correct.
Yes, how you use this printing and writing, and
Right.
because you also your work is a lot of language.
Yes. Yep.
And was that always
Yep.
true?
So, well, I would say on some level, I've always really, really, really been interested in, you know, making prints, but just the print medium in general. So I think one of the first prints I made when I was working at Johnson & Wales, but then I was using a small offset press that was at URI, University of Rhode Island. So the person I was making my first artist book for, so for commercially, my first project was I was doing someone's sister's bat mitzvah invitation, offset printed. I was doing somebody's like summer camp brochure, and then this artist book for this guy Gary Richmond. Mm-hmm. And so,
But then you were using somebody else's press.
Correct. And so I was using this press at URI, and so he had said, "Hey, if you're willing to talk to the students about it while you're doing this stuff, then no problems." I'm like, great. And so, but right from the beginning, when I was working my own artwork, I was working with an artist to do a project, I was doing an invitation, and then some commercial work. And what's strange is, 10, 20, 30 years later, that's kind of the same, that's how our commercial shop is still sort of split up. You're doing work like editioning your prints, working with other artists, doing our own work, doing a lot of invitation printing, and then commercial printing as well for letterpress. So it is it's weird that just by happenstance that same split, a third and a third and a third is still what we did. But so reproductions of already printed things. So the first thing in that sort of series was the bottom of a McDonald's bag. And so it has like, the McDonald's, actually I don't think it has a McDonald's symbol, but it has like a copyright, something, 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 and then it has a pictographic diagram so they could use it all over the world and this is bag like C. So anyone who's worked in McDonald's would know the difference between like a bag A, a bag B, a bag C, a bag D. So a bag C was like, it could be used for, and there's a little pictogram, it's like hamburger, hamburger and french fry, 2 hamburgers and french fry, or 3 hamburgers, and so that's the pictogram, right? And so that idea, that's all the sort of coded information on the bottom of the McDonald's bag. So then, I was then making an edition print of the bottom of this bag, and then had calligraphy on the bottom of it that said diploma. So there's definitely a text element sort of from the beginning. And then for a long time, I forgot about this, I was taking pictures of toilets. So I also did a lot of photography.
Oh, that's
and
right.
so
I did a whole toilet series.
And so I was interested in photography, but it was much more interested in doing a sort of photography in print, so in ink. So for example, I definitely would say when you're asking about the printmaking, when I was still at McGill, I took a summer class, being from and in Rhode Island at the time, at RISD with Henry Ferreira, called Light to Ink. And it was, how to print photographs in ink, breaking them into halftone screens and all this stuff. And this is what's such a strange thing is then teaching at RISD part-time, 20 years later, 15 years later, there was somebody couldn't teach that class, so they asked me to teach it. And it was so crazy because when I first took that summer class, a photograph was a photograph, there was like a silver gelatin or a platinum print or whatever it would be, but a photograph was a photograph. And then a printed photograph was a big deal. That's how you experience photographs in the newspaper and in books. But to make a printed photograph was weird, right? To do a photograph in ink. Whereas 15 years later, you're teaching the exact same class, right? And suddenly, the way almost everybody ever experienced photographs was with an inkjet or an offset or whatever. Like the actual photograph had become the really weird thing, which was sort of a strange thing.
Because you're not using a negative.
Correct.
Going on. So why don't you talk a little bit about the project that you're doing now?
Yes.
That you just.
So the project I'm doing now, letterpress printing. Oh, the Linotype Daily.
Yes.
I am stuck in the past. I realize I've been working with newspaper imagery for a very, very long time, reproducing old newspapers. I have a big print that's a relief print, and the headline is Antichrist is alive and a male Jew, Falwell contends. And it was some article of Jerry Falwell in the 1980s. And so I realized I've also been very much interested in that sort of newspaper typography and the role that's playing in the culture. So in my shop, I have a machine called a Linotype machine. So Linotype is
Go on.
So the Linotype is this crazy machine that was invented in the 1880s, and basically in commercial printing in the Western world, you had handset typesetting from Gutenberg in 1450. Basically from 1450 to 1850, almost 1900, all commercial printing is being done with handset cast metal or routed out wood type, right? So any newspaper, any book printed say 1890 to 90, let's say any book pre-1900 is someone is setting individual characters for that entire page or that entire galley, right? That signature. And then they're printing that signature, redistributing the type, resetting the type for the next signature, and on and on and on and on. So there's a big push, a big race to how can they automate this process. And so the Linotype machine, which was invented by a German immigrant, Ottmar Mergenthaler, was the one machine that actually did this successfully. And basically the way it works is you have a keyboard, and this is in the time that typewriters are also being invented. So the whole idea of a keyboard, to interpret your thoughts into a keyboard, and then this machine somehow is still relatively new. So there's not like an established keyboard setting. All these companies are coming up with their own. So with a Linotype machine, what happens is you have a keyboard, and every time you tap a key, it drops a matrix. And the matrix is basically the reverse. It's the mold of an individual character of type, like in individual letter form. And so as you're typing, these are called line casting machines versus monotype machine, which is casting individual characters. As you're typing, you could type, Jonathan Weinberg, right? And it's going to drop all the matrices, the molds for the letters Jonathan, etc. And it lines them all up, and then you go to cast, and it lifts it up, brings it over to the casting system, and at that point you can start typing your next line. So you're just like type. It's doing three things simultaneously: composing the type, casting the type. There's a pot of molten lead and a crucible behind the machine. A plunger goes down, it pushes the molten lead into the mold that you've just set up with all the type. Cast Jonathan Weinberg's name, instantly solidifies because it's no longer being heated. The slug with the type on it pops out, and then the matrices, the molds go up to the top of the machine, and they have this crazy key system sort of indented into it. So it rides on the back of the machine on this bar, and they instantly drop into the correct slots, right? So it's redistributing, casting, and composing your type all simultaneously. And it's completely crazy. It has 3,000 moving parts. It's like an insane machine. So this machine, my Mergenthaler's machine, is the machine that sort of is able to solve this problem. They have these huge steam-powered presses. They've got all this stuff going on, but the slow part is still hand typesetting, right? So,
which you have to do for headlines and things.
Exactly. So you'd still continue to do that for headlines. But so this machine, 1885, so 1890s, it's sort of like it really is like the second information revolution. So that you have Gutenberg, printing, all these ideas are getting shared around. It's like Gutenberg is really like the internet being invented, and then the Linotype is sort of like the World Wide Web, where you're all of a sudden it's just like, it's already changed everything, but then you're like, whoa, this could really change everything. So like school textbooks, a town could have a 20-page newspaper instead of a 6-page newspaper, and it could have 5 20-page newspapers because the cost of doing it is just so much cheaper. So I use the Linotype, we use the cast type to stamp on pencils, we'll use it to work with poetry projects or writing projects, business cards. But historically, it was the machine that sort of sped up the information culture. So newspaper culture was already pretty fast, right? But with the Linotype machine, all of those voices could be amplified, larger and faster. And so in our age, where there's such like an information overload, one crisis, is overshadowed by the next crisis, is overshadowed by the next outrage, and over to the point where you can't even process anything. I'm looking at the Linotype as the machine where we sort of took these initial steps. I mean, really, you could say radio and television, and then the internet. But the Linotype is the machine that's sort of starting into this. It's a contributor to the news cycle. And so then I have had these 2 Linotype machines in my shop, and we'll work with them with art projects, but trying to sort of find a way that really makes sense to use them. And so then, being also interested in politics and in the news, decided to do this project called the Linotype Daily. And so the Linotype Daily, what I decided to do is I would use the Linotype to I would cast type, write, cast the type, and then print a new print every single day for a year to sort of document the daily events of that year. And so
what's really interesting is the way in which you're using it in a sense to slow things down.
Correct, yeah.
Right, and to sort of mark things that are significant when these things were invented, they would have been seen as things to speed things up. And
exactly.
That's very interesting, the way in which you might say almost archaic modes are being used in that way, just like kind of obsessed with fountain pens, or people are using record players to listen to.
Very similar.
Of certain kind of trying to resist technology, but in a funny way using technology to do that. Using older technologies.
And then part of it too, the older tech, everything's going to have an ideal world. All of this technology still has a person in their hands, or at least a person and their thoughts, behind it. And so what's interesting about this project is, the amount of effort it would take me, let's say, some days really fast, come up with the idea, super simple, set the type, cast the type, lock it up in a press, print the type, and then I would photograph it and put it on the internet, social media and Instagram. And so that's the other part of it, is that you might have 4,000 people following it on Instagram, but you've only made 100 prints. Mm-hmm. But because it's handmade, people are paying more attention to it. And then because it's got that impression,
right?
Suddenly it has more authority than if it's just a meme that says something or other. Right. It's very strange. That aspect of it is continually.
There's also interesting the way how they influence language in interesting ways. So when I actually worked on a press when I'm in high school, and we produced our own newspaper and everything else. But there were certain things that. So when you were copy editing, you'd already set the type and everything else. You edited very much with the idea. Well, it was a pain in the neck to replace a whole column. So you only if you changed a word, you want to change a word that was the same size, and you had to do all this kind of accommodating the technology, and that actually influenced what was said. Just as headlines had to be a certain size, right, and fit in a certain way. Now, technology is such that you don't have to really worry about things like that. And so people don't charge. They used to charge you by every word that you had to change in a book, because it was so much work to change something. But now that's not the case in the same way, in terms of editing things and copy editing.
What's also weird, like the old-timey printers get so upset because there's so many typos in newspapers now.
Right.
And they're also upset because it's so much easier to fix it now. So it's not a question of it being difficult to fix. They just don't want to hire the proofreaders or take the time.
Well, that's true too. Right.
So basically, I did it for a year, and it was a pretty intense project. So I'm still working full time. And then maybe at lunchtime, I'm, paying way too much attention. So I'm on Twitter, listening to the news all the time, because I'm trying to sort of follow what's happening both in the news, but also just what's happening, in my own daily life. So one day the print might just be a list of all the things that I have to do that day because I like to make lists, and I also have to make this print every day. And so that's still going on, but then I took all the prints from that first year, which are the everyday prints, and it's boxed into a box set called the Linotype Daily. And so now I'm just about to print a prospectus and start to try to get that into the world. So there's a couple, like some museums that had already collected my work and some collections like that, and then I'm going to announce it and see where it goes. So
cool.
That is that, but it is a strange thing looking through it, because when you're doing something I'd never done like a daily art project, because when you're doing something every day, who would think the horrors and the anxiety and the adrenaline pressed anxiety that would be happening day after day after day when Donald Trump was president could continue. But then you get into the coronavirus, and then you get into everything else, and it's just having a daily response to all these things has been very interesting and kind of shocking.
Right. And do you find that it's comforting to sort of to handle it that way, or does it make it more
I would say
upsetting?
It's throughout these last 3 or 4 years, because this started in 2019, I guess, in March. I've had many people tell me that this is how they are coping by reading these posts, which is another thing as an artist that's kind of, it's always interesting when you're it's not that I feel like I have some particular insight, but you're saying something that a lot of other people are also feeling. And that's one of the things, just in terms of, it's like the Ramones and punk rock, like anybody could start a band. And these two goofballs start this band, and they are very particular, and they're unique and individual kind of things. But apparently it's really responds because other people are feeling the same way. And do
you put happy things in there too?
Yes. Yeah, no, for sure. So for example, just recently David Ortiz was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I made a print that just said his name, Big Papi, and all this sort of stuff for baseball people. Then when I was doing it every day, and even still to this day, sometimes it would be a quote from somebody, sometimes it would be a depressing quote, sometimes it would not be a depressing quote. Sometimes it would be more inspiring. Sometimes they would just be goofy, like, I couldn't find any capital T's, so I spent 4 hours searching for the capital T's, and then I found it here. These kinds of just sort of daily observations. And then one of them was, a play on the whistleblower and Alexander Vindman and all of that stuff during the first impeachment. And the headline was, what was it? Oh, teenage whistleblower alleges her dad ate all the peanut butter, right? And this was the true story of my daughter yelling at me for eating all the peanut butter, which I don't know if I'd eaten or not, but that's what she was alleging. And then there were some other ones.
Well, who did eat the peanut butter if you didn't eat it?
I don't remember, but we're the only 2 people in the house. So,
how old is your daughter?
Now she is 19, so she would have been 16 or so, something like that. Yeah, she's just looking for trouble. But let's say you've just finished something, whether you're a writer and it's a book, or you're a painter or something. Sometimes you finish something and you're like vaguely satisfied, like it's okay, but it's done. You feel like you're good. You think it's okay.
Yeah.
Right. Good enough. Done. You're relatively happy with it. Right. Then day goes by, and then there's always this sort of slight anxiety. You're just like, man, if it was the last painting I ever made because I don't have any more. You know, you're before you started on some other project,
Right.
and that's not like
So
I'm
it's a
always
challenge. Sometimes the best things you do are kind of upsetting because how are you going to do that again?
Exactly, right.
Right.
And so in some ways that thinking, some of that thinking is, okay, the only way you're thinking about that is you're stuck in thinking that's the only way you can make something. And so you have to kind of remember that even if it's the exact same process over and over again, you're almost reinventing the exact same process over and over again.
Does
that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's very hard to know, you know, in a certain way. You make something good and you're like, oh, well, I'll never make something good like that again. Or how did I do that? And often, you know, one of the things about painting is that often a bad painting is underneath a good painting. Well, for example, if I get a likeness too quickly in a portrait, sometimes it's a problem because then I become very sort of, I don't want to
You're kind of protective of it.
Right, you're protective of it, and that can be a problem sometimes. But I'm always a great, fan is the right word, but I want the painting that I worked the longest and hardest on to be my best painting. I don't want to I don't want to have a kind of practice where, you know, it has to be some kind of inspiration or something. I want it to be like if I work really hard in the studio, if I go in every day, I'm going to get someplace else. And as a teacher, I always sort of say this at the end of the semester at RISD. It seems to me always the students that do the best are the ones who go in and just keep working. You know, they get someplace else, you know, while, you know, this sort of, that's the hard part. That's always the hard part, is just going in and getting and doing it, you know, doing it day after day. I mean, people think of you think of an artist like Van Gogh, who, you know, everybody thinks of as being the most expressionist, the most feeling, but what's incredible about him is how hard he worked. He went out every day, often did 3 paintings in a day. You know, it's sort of that hard work, you know, that doesn't get talked enough about.
Well, I think in some ways,
and I suppose that is about questioning, and certainly that's part of that. It's not just working, but in some ways,
it's
the day-to-dayness of it, actually.
No, I think that's a really good point, because in some ways, I always feel like before I was talking about liking the distraction of the printing or printmaking medium. Part of it, you can use the word distraction or questioning or whatever. Questioning doesn't work as well in that context, but the distraction of it. But really, it's just the doing of it. And I feel like one of the things that's so interesting with these, even like I'm just casting one line of type, and then I'm, you know, maybe there's line of type plus the date and something else, and then you're printing it. But there's just, I really do feel like there's some weird thing that's happening. Like you're working on a painting, there's some transference of some energy, and it's not like, without getting super metaphysical, but there's some transference of that. And I don't want to use the word integrity because I don't want to make it sound too positive, but there's some transfers of that work that's getting through somehow, that is what the only thing that makes the finished product to me kind of have a little bit of weight or worth, because it has that little bit of that life into it.
Right. Well, that's one of the reasons why I guess kind of, I don't know if realist is the right word, but I have to work from something, because I feel like if you're intensely interested in something, if you care about it, that's going to come across in the work that you're doing. So and that could be the love of the medium, you know, that you really love, you know, the way the ink goes onto the paper and the press, and that whole thing can actually be part of the subject in a certain way. It can drive the work, you know, and also you know, as I say again, your whole work is about this sort of day-to-dayness of one thing after another. Right? You know, that to me is the appeal of a series. I mean, the reason I started doing these portraits was that it was a very difficult time in my life. I hadn't really done people that much. And I just decided I would just do one after another in the most stupid way possible. Just put somebody in front of a picture and paint it, knowing also that I wasn't very good at it. I mean, I'm still not good at it. I never feel comfortable doing it. I never feel like I'm going to, you know, it's just an easy thing to do. You know, like you read about Sargent or something that he got bored with it because he could just do it so well. I always feel like it's never going to come out right. I never feel completely comfortable with it. Well, I think we're at a good do we have questions for me? Something you want to
Let's
talk
see.
about?
Well, I would say in some ways it's interesting that that's a good place to end, because in all this talk about printmaking and printing and all this sort of stuff, I also feel the same way. And it's not even like it's an insecurity. It's more like just an acknowledgement of like even with teaching, I say like, okay, I don't think I'm a very good teacher, but I come in and I'm being, as honest as you can be, vaguely, with these students, and somehow they really appreciate that.
The way that you took my work, and then it seems to you brought it to a whole other level, which is the other exciting thing about which we haven't really talked about, but you are often working with
you asked
other.
me one question, and I sat here for 2 hours answering it.
Well, but you work with other artists,
Yes.
and then you're able to turn what they do and sort of bring it to another level. The collaborative nature of what you do is very
To me, that's just so deeply that's what it's such a, in some ways, working with the press or working with a person, you're trying to get a particular result. So you're showing me these drawings, and I'm not seeing this finished print, but I'm seeing one way that they could be interpreted into this finished print, which just seems like that's already what you've done. And I'm the tool in which this thing's coming to its fruition in this other form. So to me, it's not necessarily magical. I'm just saying like, oh yeah, this would work really well as a letterpress print. And so I'm saying, and then you see the letterpress print, you go, oh my God, it's so amazing. I'm like, no, I just took this thing and made it into plate and went, and here it is.
Right,
but that's because I'm so familiar with it.
Right.
That whole part is just a natural step.
Right.
For somebody else, it seems strange.
But also, it's like you're riffing on it. It's one of the things that kind of frustrating in teaching on the graduate level, that if you give often if you will give a suggestion to a student, they won't take it because they feel threatened by it in a funny way. They think, oh, it won't be their idea if you give them a suggestion. But the suggestion you're giving them is just played off of their work. It's that it's really suggested by their work.
Correct.
And it isn't something that you would have come up with without that work, right? So again, like the really good student is in a way confident enough actually to take that suggestion and run with it.
No, that's the fun thing with printmaking and then teaching printmaking too, is that there's not so many rules, but there are methods. And so the more you get better at the methods, the more then you can sort of break the methods. But it's also because there's sort of like this, here's this material, and some people aren't going to follow these rules at all, but it's sort of, there's at least a built-in structure. So the more sophisticated people get at it, and sometimes it's useful for them and sometimes it isn't, but there's a certain level of common language you have to get to, which is kind of fun.
Yes.
Which makes sense. So